In 1964, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a book entitled Why We Can't Wait. This book was designed as an apologetic to both the critic and the curious, chronicling the reasons behind and the momentous recent and ongoing events of what he called the Third American Revolution, or otherwise known as the Civil Rights Movement. He said regarding this revolution, 300 years of humiliation, abuse, and deprivation cannot be expected to find voice in a whisper. It was in light of this reality, he argued, that three options were possible. The revolution could turn towards violence. The revolution could fizzle out and resolve towards the status quo. Or the revolution could follow a Christian path of loving, nonviolent direct action. The heart of his argument is found in the middle chapter of the book, The Letter from a Birmingham Jail. This letter was written while Dr. King was in jail for 8 days, beginning on Good Friday, 1963. And he wrote this letter in response to clergy who criticized his presence, his pace, and his practices in Birmingham. In response, he argued for both the biblical and the moral righteousness of their movement. And he expressed his desire that his critics come join him in the movement. Dr. King gave a number of arguments for why their movement couldn't wait. But at the end of the day, one argument stood out above all the rest. Shortly after Dr. King released his book, Dr. King said the following. He said, "We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish together as fools." For Dr. King, who was living in a time of social upheaval and revolution, not pursuing the work of the movement would result in fatal consequences. In the book of Hebrews, the author is writing to an audience who is living in their own time of social upheaval and revolution. Many New Testament scholars believe that the audience is a community of Hellenistic Jewish Christians. In other words, they were Jewish by ethnicity and heritage. They were Greco-Roman by culture. And they were Christian by faith. They were living during a time in which Israel was in revolution against Rome, a revolution which would soon end in the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple itself. And at the same time, Christians have also just finished enduring a season of persecution at the hands of none other than the Roman Emperor Nero, a persecution which resulted in the martyrdom of the Apostle Paul. And this community that the author of Hebrews is writing to was no strangers themselves to persecution. They had endured ridicule and scorn. They had had their property seized, and they had even endured imprisonment because of their witness for Christ. They had done this willingly, standing with those who were being persecuted and visiting and caring for those who had gone to prison. But now, as the author of Hebrews is writing them, they were in danger of drifting away from Christ and from their witness for him. Scholars believe that their turning away from Christ was not primarily due to doctrinal or theological differences, but instead it was the pressures of society that was leading them to reconsider their direction. Some scholars believe that the Jewish brethren were encouraging them to return to Judaism, while other scholars believe that their Greco-Roman society was pressuring them to conform to societal values and norms. So, in other words, they were being pulled from multiple directions. If they chose to side with their Jewish brothers and return to Judaism, then they're siding with a community that is now in revolution, violent revolution against Rome. But if they side with their Greco-Roman brothers, then in that situation, they are giving in to the status quo. But if they stay with the Christian direction, then they will be disappointing both their Jewish brothers and the Greco-Roman society. And so they had a choice: return to Judaism, stay within the Greco-Roman society, or continue to follow the way of Christ. So the author of Hebrews encouraged them to continue to follow the way of Christ. One translation of verse 23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering." And throughout the book, the author gave them a number of arguments for doing so. But there's one argument which is presented in two different ways in this passage, which stands out. In verse 23, the author says that they should keep going, for he who promised is faithful. And at the end of verse 25, the author says they should keep going all the more as they see the day drawing near. Their ultimate motivation for continuing to follow Christ was the second coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. For those who continued following Christ, they would be rewarded. He who promised is faithful. But for those who abandoned following Christ, they would face judgment, for the day is drawing near. So the bottom line is that for the audience of the book of Hebrews, who are living in a time of social upheaval and revolution, not pursuing the work of the Christian movement would have not just fatal consequences, but eternal consequences. In other words, they couldn't wait because eternity was at stake. So what does it look like to do the work of the movement or to continue to follow the way of Christ? Verses 24 and 25 give us a clue. Taken together, these verses tell us that we should look for ways to stimulate or to provoke one another to practice love and good deeds. But this can only happen if we draw closer to one another, encouraging one another instead of pulling away from one another. Times of crisis and upheaval, the author of Hebrews says, are not times to drop out, but instead they are times to step in, to renew our commitment to Christ and to one another through love and good works, and to encourage one another to do the same. You know, the actions of the early church, caring holistically for the poor, as well as showing hospitality to strangers, caring for the widow, for the orphan, rescuing and caring for babies abandoned to infanticide. These actions helped to strengthen the church's commitment to Christ and served as a countercultural witness for Christ against the societal norms of their day. As Dr. King wrote, in those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion, but instead it was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. You know, one of my favorite and more recent examples of this exhortation put into practice was Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. Born to former slaves, she graduated from Moody Bible Institute in 1895 with the intention of becoming a missionary. When she was denied the opportunity to do missions, she took a job teaching elementary school girls in Georgia. And there she was inspired by her principal, Lucy Craft Laney, who was herself a daughter of former slaves. And in 1904, she moved to Daytona Beach, Florida, to begin a school for African American girls. Starting with only $1.50, she helped build that school into a co-ed university which still exists today. But her good works didn't stop there. When one of her students was refused admission to the local hospital because of her race, she helped create another hospital in Daytona, which was open to all people regardless of race, and which served a pivotal role in the community during the 1918 influenza pandemic. She led voter registration and anti-lynching campaigns. She founded an organization for African American women, which still exists today. She helped create and serve on President Roosevelt's informal Black cabinet, which addressed the needs of African Americans during the Great Depression. And she was appointed by President Truman as the only woman of color at the founding conference of the United Nations. When Dr. Bethune died, one columnist said of her, she gave out faith and hope as if they were pills, and she some sort of doctor. But speaking of her own motivation, she wrote before her death, I had faith in a loving God, faith in myself, and a desire to serve. All of these good works came from one woman with a Christian college education who was inspired by a Christian elementary school principal. Today, we are living in a time of upheaval. Racial, social, and economic tensions, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, they all threaten to pull us apart. Violent revolution has emerged as an option for some, and others long for a return to the status quo. But the question is, Biola family, what will be our response? Will we give into the violence? Violence not only of actions, but also violence of words and of heart? Discouraging instead of encouraging one another? Will we succumb to the status quo, ignoring the cries and plight of those in pain and in need, both amongst us and around us? Will we opt out altogether, saying, we're tired. I'm tired. Tired of the endless messages and conversations. Tired of doing the work and seeing little result. Tired of the opposition we face. Just tired. Or will we recommit ourselves to the Christ who is faithful and to the work of the Christian movement, the way of Christ, looking to engage more with one another instead of running from each other, encouraging one another with our words and deeds instead of discouraging each other, and provoking one another towards practicing love and good works which will benefit all. In the Birmingham campaign in 1963, all participants in the Birmingham marches and protests after their rigorous training and testing were required to commit themselves to 10 commandments of the nonviolent movement. And here are a few of those commandments. Number 1, meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus. Number 2, remember that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Victory is not the goal. Number 3, walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Number 4, pray daily to be used by God in order that all might be free. Number 5, sacrifice personal wishes in order that all might be free. Number 6, observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. In other words, treat everybody with respect. Number 7, seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. Number 8, refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Number 9, strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. And number 10, follow the directions of the movement and of the movement's leaders. These are the commitments that they committed themselves to in this nonviolent movement. And so the question, Biola, is what will we commit ourselves to? However we choose to respond, let us remember the admonition of the author of Hebrews. Our decision has eternal consequences. We can't afford to wait because eternity is at stake.
Thank you, Walter, for sharing your wisdom with us today. I'm so excited to dive in a little bit more to this. But first, pressing question, because you've lived in 3 of the nation's biggest cities, Chicago, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Los Angeles. You have to tell us which one's the best.
Wow, that's a tough question because there's actually a 4th city that I lived in, which actually, Los Angeles was my favorite, and that is Washington, D.C. That's why I did my undergraduate work. And I loved Washington because it's a mix of both North and South. It's a small enough city that you can cross it in 15 minutes, but it's a big enough city that it's sort of a cosmopolitan feel to it. And then finally, you'll never know who you might meet in Washington, D.C. So one day I actually got a chance to meet the architect and the creator of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. And he was telling my wife and I stories about how this whole thing came about. And so it was just a fascinating time. I love Washington, D.C. I think that's my
so
favorite.
Much history that's there. That's very cool.
Yes.
Hey, I want to talk about a quote you shared with us from Dr. King. You talked about how the revolution will either turn towards violence, or it will fizzle out, or it can turn towards a Christian nonviolent direct action, loving action. A thing this reminded me of was the instincts for fight or flight. When we're presented with something that we're not comfortable with, we either fight back or we go away from it, run away from it. But it seems he's proposing there's a third way. As followers of Christ, there's a third way. Can you elaborate more on that?
Sure. And yes, I think your instincts are exactly spot on. What Dr. King is arguing, and we can never forget, he was a pastor first. So he was from a Christian background, and so he knew the Word of God very well. And so he understood that the way of Jesus was a third way in between violence or acquiescing to the status quo. And so he was arguing that the most successful way for the civil rights movement to move forward would be in a way of nonviolent yet direct action. He argued this for 2 reasons. One, he said, is that practically it is the best way to move forward. Violence only begets more violence.
Yeah.
But the other side, he said, was moral and spiritual. He said that he advocated for this because some people say that the ends justify the means, but for himself, he said the ends are inherent in the means. So if you want people to be nonviolent towards you, you need to be nonviolent towards them.
Right. So I'm thinking about our current situation today. The temptation towards those first 2 is so, it just feels so much stronger. It's so easy to just to fight hard back, or to run away, back down. What would you recommend as ways to lean into that third way? What's our motivation to do kind of that harder step?
Well, I believe that as Christians, as believers, there are a few motivations for us to lean into that third way. One, which I spoke about in my message, is the eschatological reason or the eternal reason. In other words, the decisions that we make don't just have consequences for today, but as Christians, the decisions that we make have consequences for eternity. And eventually we have to stand before Christ and give an account for what we have done in our bodies on this earth. But a second motivation, I would say, and this is also what the author of Hebrews is getting at, is not just eternal consequences, but a second motivation is one another. It's really hard to do this alone, but it becomes easier to do it when you're with others who are going in the same direction. And so if you can find others who have this same heart for nonviolent direct action, loving nonviolent direct action, you can encourage one another. And that's what the civil rights movement was all about.
Yeah. Another thing I love from the movement that you mentioned was this list of, I think they're commandments, 10 commandments of the movement. And as you were reading those, I was thinking, this feels like a list of spiritual disciplines, things I just need to engage in every day to stay, again, motivated, to stay with the movement. Can you talk about this, maybe a connection between spiritual disciplines and nonviolent resistance?
Yes. So I think there are a few connections that take place there. One is just, again, the civil rights movement was a church-based, church-led movement.
Yeah.
So they were in Christ. And so for them, the source of their strength, the source of their endurance, the source of their ability to not strike back was Christ. And so that's why they advocated for those who were involved in the movement to read and to meditate upon the life and the teachings of Jesus on a daily basis, to not seek out victory, but to seek out justice and reconciliation. All Christian principles, which we find in Christ, which we find in the gospel. And so there are some direct connections that are there between those practices and those spiritual disciplines that we can practice every day and how they can sustain us in our work for Christ going forward.
Yeah, that's so good. A thing you talked about from Hebrews was this idea of spurring one another on towards love and good deeds. Some translations say provoke. And that kind of struck me of like, oh, provoke is often like a negative thing. If I provoke you, it's going to lead you to anger or frustration or maybe even violence. But he kind of turns it on his head to say, provoke towards love and good deeds. And so what does it mean for us to do that? How do we actually do that for one another?
Great question. So real quickly, just that term that is translated sometimes provoke, that specific term is only used twice in the New Testament. Once in this passage, but in the other passage in the book of Acts, in chapter 15, it is used in talking about the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark, and how essentially this disagreement became so sharp, it provoked Paul and Barnabas to splitting apart. So it really is sort of a poking and a prodding of one another, but with an end result here, or the goal being love and good deeds. Let me just put it to you this way on a practical level. The civil rights movement was a movement all about love and good deeds and provoking others toward love and good deeds. Dr. King said that much of the protests that they did, the boycotts, the sit-ins, the marches, going to jail, he said the purpose for doing that was so that he was hoping to stir up in those who were opposing him a heart that would turn them towards brotherhood and love and justice. So his goal was literally to provoke others. He did not mind creative tension. He said tension can be a good thing. And so he said we need to find creative ways to spur one another on, to provoke one another towards following the way of Christ and doing those loving good deeds that Christ has called us to. And one final thought that I will just throw in there is that sometimes we do that by our own actions. We serve as inspirations for others. I gave the example of Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. She learned about this. She was provoked by the example of her principal, Lucy Craft Laney, and she spoke about her in her own autobiography. She said, if I had not seen her doing what she did, she said that stirred something up in my heart, which caused me to want to go and do the same thing. And so sometimes even just by our lives, our actions, we can stir one another up and provoke one another towards those love and good deeds.
Yeah, that's so good. So last question on that note, what's a way that we can let Dr. King maybe stir us up or provoke us towards that type of action? Is there any like book or documentary or certain thing that you think would just be good inspiration for us to follow in a similar way of following Christ?
Great question. There's so much that I could recommend, but I'll just limit it to a few items. One is that I would suggest, if you want to read, one of the great places to start is a book that he wrote called Strength to Love. Within this book, it's a collection of his sermons around his motivation, which was an ethic of love and a heart of love based in the gospel. And so I think that's a great place for people to start to understand Dr. King's heart and also just his approaches. If you want to learn a little bit historically, you can read the book Why We Can't Wait, which is about the 1963 Birmingham campaign, or Stride Toward Freedom, which is about the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. And then finally, if you're not a reader, if you're more of an audio person, maybe.
That's me.
Yes, there's both audio and visual. So there are a number of different documentaries that are out there. One of the ones I would talk about, it's a long one. It's called Eyes on the Prize, which talks about the whole civil rights movement. If you want to listen, if you love sermons, there is a set of sermons called A Call to Conscience, which basically has a bunch of Dr. King's sermons, but you can also find a number of them on YouTube as well for free if you don't want to go and pay for some of those sermons.
That's great. Well, thanks, Walter, so much for sharing all this with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's great being with you all.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.